This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Oh boy, this is going to be a long video. Anyways, hi guys, I'm back with another video, and in this video I'm working on KDA Akali's largest weapon. I think it's called a Kama. And to start off, I'm taking 4mm EVA foam. It's high density foam that I got from Cosplay Crafts, and I'm tracing the patterns that I made out onto that foam. There's a lot of pieces, so this takes quite some time. If you want to skip having to pattern all of this yourself, I do have these patterns available on my store, Envy and Etsy. Make sure you are labeling all of your pieces on the foam as well as on the piece of paper, like the pattern piece, as you go along, so that you don't get confused about which piece is which and what goes where, because a lot of these pieces start looking the same. It's also helpful to have a full reference photo of your pattern, so like your pattern pieced together as one full thing to look off of as you build it, so that you remember which piece connects to which piece. Once you have everything traced out, go ahead and cut it out. I used a box cutter or X-Acto knife for this. Scissors work as well. Now that everything's cut out, I can start the building process. And to do this, I am starting with smaller sections of the prop at a time. So I'm starting with this large blade that is at the end, and I'm taking these pieces and cutting away the sides at an angle, and then sanding that down so that they have a bevel to them. And you want this bevel because the pieces have to look bent or attached at an angle, and whether or not you bevel the edge on the right side of the foam, like the foam side that's showing, or the wrong side of the foam, depends on which way you need the bend or the point to point towards. So if you need it to be bent so that it's outwards, like pointing away from the inside of the prop or the wrong side of the prop, then you need to bevel the wrong side. And if you need it to bend inwards so that it's pointing towards the inside of the prop, then you need to bevel the right side of the foam. You're going to want to look at a reference photo to figure out which pieces need to bend which way. I found that a majority of the pieces on this build have to point away from the inside of the prop. Like the bend on them has to point outwards. That was a lot of explaining. Oh my gosh. Anyways, once you've got the pieces beveled, and I didn't bevel them all at once, I did it again in small sections. I focused on one section at a time. So once I got the bevels done on the section that I was focusing on, I went ahead and applied contact cement to all those edges that are going to be connecting to one another, and then let that sit and get tacky following the instructions on the bottle. And then once that had sat for a while, I went ahead and stuck the pieces together. And then I went ahead and repeated this process for all of the other sections of the build. And you don't have to do it this way. I found this to be the easiest way, but if you prefer working from one end to the other rather than in small sections and then combining all those sections together at the end, that's totally up to you. Whatever helps you stay organized and track of everything the best is how you should do it. My pattern that I have on my store Envy and Etsy for this prop and her other blade prop do come together as a whole piece, so you always have a reference photo to look back on in case you lose track of which piece goes where.
The wind is blowing through her hair. We like to head out on the road, and you know we don't really care, cause we're just doing what we want. She likes it when I treat her good. She likes it when I treat her bad. She likes to travel all around. I take her everywhere and back. Yeah, oh, you fucking with the man, girl. You throw it right back, no, I like that. I'ma bite back, you know I've become a fan, girl. The way you throw back like a Kodak, girl, you own that. Cruise around without a plan, girl. We'll never go back, girl, you know that. You were so bad, let's just spend a couple grand, girl. You know you're fucking with the man, girl. Yeah. Oh, you could've been a good girl, but instead you chose a real world. Yeah, you've always been a savage. Oh, you've always been a bad chick. I don't care if you got issues. Daddy left, but I'm with you. So come with me, never look back. We're living life like a badass. Oh, you could have been a good girl, but instead you took the real world. Yeah, you've always been a savage. Oh, you've always been a renegade. I don't care if you got issues. Daddy left, but I'm with you. So come with me, never look back. We're living life like a badass. Cruising PCH with the top down, drop down, headed nowhere fast, never stop now, not now. We ain't slowing down, never knowing that. We're just headed south, what it's all about, never out of doubt, yeah. She be sitting shotgun, she a hot one, in the hot sun, crop top on, I'ma hop on. Every single day, head a different way, never stay in place, don't care what they say, we gon' do it anyway.
So here I'm taking a break from all of the gluing and using my pattern to draw out the lines on the handle piece for this prop, where you have to, or where I'm going to be scoring it with a X-Acto knife. When you score foam, that means you make a cut in the foam, but you do not cut all the way through. You only cut a small portion of the way through the foam, and then you hit it with a heat gun, and it will open those lines right up, and you'll have these carvings or engravings in the foam. And that's the method that I'm using to create this crosshatch pattern that her foam has. That her blade has, not her foam has. That the handle of the blade has. And now I return to the long process of gluing all of these pieces together. So here I've glued all of the smaller sections that I was working on together, and they're all finally attached, and now almost one completed blade. All that's left is to glue one side of the blade to the other side of the blade. Or, yeah. So one thing I decided to do before gluing the two sides together was apply hot glue into all of the seams, and I did this just to make sure everything was nice and secure and going to hold together well, even though contact cement is already really strong and it probably didn't need this. It just made me feel better about the build. I had these leftover plastic dowels from old pom-poms that I had cut off the handle to, and I glued those into the very end of the blade using contact cement on either side, just for some added strength so that the blade wouldn't bend, because foam tends to bend a little bit. So you're going to want to find some sort of fairly lightweight dowel to stick in the blade, and if it's even longer than this, then that's even better. Maybe even a wooden dowel will work as long as it's fairly thin, because you don't want it to get too heavy. I'm afraid that might weigh down the blade and warp it anyways, which is what we're trying to use these for to avoid. When gluing a piece like this larger piece together, I prefer to work in smaller sections, so I apply contact cement through just a small section of it, attach that, and then go back in and apply more contact cement, moving along the blade in another small section, attach that, and so on until I get to the very end of the blade and everything is glued together. For the handle part of the blade, I stuck one side together and left the other side open because I needed to stick a wooden dowel into it. At first I was going to use this wooden dowel so that the blade would be able to be disassembled, but I decided since I wasn't going to really be traveling far away with this, I didn't need to bother with that. However, I did keep the dowel in because it did provide extra support. So you're going to want some sort of wooden dowel in the blade handle that attaches to the top, the blade part of the blade, the gold part of the blade, just to make sure everything's really secure and sturdy and the top of that blade isn't just going to start to bend or something. So here's the part that I mentioned earlier where I'm gluing in that wooden dowel, and I'm gluing in so a majority of it is in the handle, and then there is at least a small portion of it that is going to stick into the rest of the blade. If you use an even longer dowel than this, that's probably better, but this was the size dowel that I had available to me. And here I'm taking 2mm EVA foam and cutting out these rectangular strips of foam in it. And this is the part that's used for the top edging of the handle piece. And I use my Dremel to sand down the edges on that and make it all nice and smooth. And I'm also using my Dremel to sand down this diamond shape. I needed to sand this quite a bit because your girl isn't good at cutting things out exactly the size that they need to be. All my pieces and always end up a bit too big or maybe a bit too small, but luckily foam is easy to fix because you could either sand it or glue some more foam on it. And that's what I had to do with the diamond. here I'm just using contact cement to glue this rectangular strip from earlier onto the top of the handle. But in the clip before this, and in the clip that you're seeing now, I was working on covering the diamond in this holographic vinyl, and that's what I put in the search tab when I found it on Amazon. It's sticky on its own, but I did not trust its adhesive, so I used contact cement instead, and to figure out the pattern for it, I just wrapped the diamond in saran wrap, and then duct tape, and then cut it out, and used that to pattern out my pieces onto the holographic vinyl, and did it in 4 sections, so all the sides of the vinyl were one piece, and then there were 2 squares on the top and the bottom, and I tried my best to smooth it out as much as possible when sticking it down. And in between, waiting for the glue to get sticky and sticking the vinyl into place, I was working on putting together the rest of the blade, so that meant gluing more pieces together and dremeling all of the pieces that needed to be dremeled because they wouldn't be able to be reached once they were glued into place. So basically, you want to make sure to sand down and smooth out all of the pieces that you won't be able to reach once it's glued. Just make sure to do that, because if you don't, you're going to have a rough time trying to sand it later. Once everything is stuck together, I start sanding down the seams because I want to make sure these seams are nice and smooth.
Always been a bad chick. I don't care if you got issues. Daddy left, but I'm with you. So come with me and never look back. We're living life like a badass.
I also used cosplay clay or clay foam that I got from Cosplay Crafts to fill in the seams. Some of the seams were rough, or there might have been a little bit of gaps here and there that weren't completely smooth or stuck together even after dremeling, so I just go back through and apply a little bit of this clay foam and then let it dry overnight and sand that down the next morning to make sure everything is really, really smooth. If you don't know what cosplay clay is, it is basically EVA foam but in a clay form. So when it dries, it works exactly like EVA foam. It can be cut, dremeled, and heated.
Letting life pass right underneath the side, grab it real tight. Okay, every day is a new day in a new place, rent a new space, see a new face in a few days, move a new way to a new state. That's great, rent an estate for our next day. Oh, you could have been a good girl, but instead you chose a real world. Yeah, you've always been a savage. Oh, you've always been a bad chick. I don't care if you got issues. Daddy left, but I'm with you. So come with me and never look back. We're living life like a badass. Oh, you could have been a good girl, but instead you chose a real world. Yeah, you've always been a savage. Oh, you've always been a bad chick. I don't care if you got issues. Daddy left, but I'm with you. So come with me and never look back. We're living life like a badass.
Whenever your heart is broken, don't ever forget you're golden. I will find the light in your soul, I'll be there. Never leaving you in the darkness, even when you're out of focus. I will be the light in your life, you'll see it clear. I'll be your inspiration, 'cause I know that you'll do just what you're told. I'll be your heart and temptation, 'cause I know that you'll make it on your own.
Now that all the sanding is done and everything is glued together, the prop is ready for priming. And to prime it, I used wood glue. I used about 5 to 7 layers of wood glue and completely covered the prop in it. I made sure to sand each layer of wood glue in between layers. So let the first layer of wood glue completely dry, sand down any rough areas because sometimes it does dry a bit lumpy if you didn't apply it smooth the first, like when you were applying it, which I never do, and then apply your second layer. And then repeat. I should say that this high density foam that I got from Cosplay Crafts is so great and so much easier to prime. One, it's a lot sturdier than the foam I usually work with because the foam I usually work with is lower density, but this foam is higher density, so it shaped easier, it cut easier, it sanded easier, and it was a lot easier to prime because it's not as porous as foam usually is. Once I finished all my layers of wood glue, I started the painting process. So I masked off this black portion that's going to be gold eventually with paper and painter's tape, but realized you probably didn't have to do that if you just paint the entire prop white to start off with, since white is a pretty good base and priming color. So like if you want to do that, you should, especially if it is a sort of paint primer. I probably should have done it, but I didn't, and there's no going back now. So, once I did paint that part white, I went through and masked that off, and then used gold spray paint to paint the rest of the prop, all the gold sections, gold. Once that paint is dry, I remove the tape and paper and then start shading the entire prop using black oil paint. And once I'm happy with the shading, I top it off with a clear, glossy coat of spray paint. And now the prop is finally done, and so is this video. This video was really long, so if you're like one of the few people, I'm pretty sure, that made it to the end, tell me what your favorite KDA skin is down in the comments. And I hope you guys found this video helpful and it will be useful, and if you use it to make something cool, go ahead and show me. Thanks for watching, have a lovely day, and bye!